Hello everyone. Today we'll be taking a look at the first steel helmet adopted by the Swedish military, the Model 1921 helmet. Unknown to many, the M21 helmet utilized design features from all three major helmets of the First World War, the British Brodie, the French Adrian, as well as the German Stahlhelm. Before I continue, I must state that there is very little information available on some of the topics that I will be covering. As such, some of the things that I will talk about may not be 100% accurate and could be based off of my own observations and interpretations. If you have more information on these topics or would like to make a correction to something I said, feel free to leave it in the comments. Sweden's search for a suitable steel helmet most likely started around 1915 during the First World War. Although they were neutral at the time, the importance of equipping their army with helmets was recognized. They examined the different helmets available at the time, the Mark I Brodie from the British, the Model 1915 Adrian from the French, as well as the German Stahlhelms, and based their own designs off of them. One of the earliest experimental Swedish helmets to be produced is one that is identified by the Swedish Army Museum as the Model 1915. Very little is known about these helmets, and there is next to no information available on them. Initially, the Swedish military likely examined the helmet designs that were available in 1915. There were only two designs available at that time, the Mark I Brodie and the M1915 Adrian helmets. The M16 Stahlhelms were not issued to German troops until the following year in 1916. The Swedish created many different experimental helmet designs based off both the Brodie as well as the Adrian. Eventually, features from both helmets would be used to create the Swedish Model 1915, which combined the crest and height of the French Adrian with the wide brim of the British Brodie. The liner is described as being made out of wool and oilcloth, materials that are also found on Mark I Brodie helmet liners. The Swedish helmets also featured a ridge down the middle of the shell and had the Swedish three crowns emblem at the front. Most of the emblems were very simple in design, although there are also examples with extremely detailed crowns. There were many different variants of the M1915 helmet manufactured, with variations being noted in features such as the crown design as well as the color. However, most helmets had the same general shape. On what are most likely the later models, the crest was omitted and only the ridge was kept. Interestingly, these later helmets also featured a triangular protrusion on the side, which serves an unknown purpose. The M1915 helmets were most likely deemed to be unsatisfactory, and a different design was sought. One possible reason for this was due to its construction material. As they were made of a very thin layer of steel, simple saber strikes were enough to severely damage the shell. As such, they would probably provide very little protection for the wearer from the dangers of the modern battlefield, including shrapnel and debris thrown out by explosions. In the years after, the factory Eskilstuna Stallpressings AB designed another helmet, and by 1918, a few hundred of these experimental helmets had been manufactured. These helmets were simply known as the Trials helmet or Trials model and were heavily influenced by the German Stahlhelms, which had already been introduced by this point. From certain angles, they looked almost identical to their World War I German counterparts. Some of the features that were derived from the German helmets included the flared skirt, ventilation horns or lugs, as well as the liner system and chin strap design. The helmet also brought over a few features from the French Adrian helmet that had been on the earlier M1915 Trials helmets, including the ridge along the middle of the shell. There was still a Swedish emblem at the front of the helmet, although the design has been changed. The shape of the crown appears to be very similar to those on the later variants of the Model 1915 helmet, but the three crowns emblem now sits inside a shield. Two main variants of the Trials helmets were produced, the Model A and Model B, with the only difference between the two models being the weight. Minor external changes would be made to the helmet, but the design stayed the same for the most part. Between 1919 and 1920, these helmets were trialed in the field. When used in the field, these helmets were sometimes given a German-style camouflage, and some even had German-style brow plates issued. However, the experimental helmets did not pass the trial stage and was not accepted by the Swedish military. As a result, the helmet was redesigned, and in the process, a lot of the German-influenced features on the helmet were lost. Interestingly, it appears that the Trials helmet stayed in service even though the design was not accepted. Many of these helmets had been found with the Swedish three crowns decals on the side, a feature that started appearing on military helmets in 1942, suggesting that some of these helmets had been refurbished and subsequently used by the Swedish military. Others were given to the police, as examples have been found with the gold police badge attached in front of the three crowns helmet badge. After the redesigning process for the helmet was completed, the end product is what would be known as the Model 1921 helmet, which would be accepted by the military and entered production around 1923. The M21 kept some of the features from the earlier trials helmets, including the ridge along the middle of the shell, as well as the three crowns helmet badge at the front, although the design of the helmet badge is slightly different. These features had been inspired by the French Model 1915 Adrian helmet. It also no longer had a dip between the visor and the skirt like the earlier helmets did, and instead, the brim and sides now looked much more like the French Model 1915 Adrian, or on the low variants, more like the British Mark I Brodie helmet. The rolled rim on the trials version, inspired by the German Stahlhelm design, was also gone. There is now a separate metal band that runs around the rim, a feature found on most British helmets of the First World War. The liner system was still distinctly German, consisting of a metal liner band and a 3-pad, 6-tongue leather liner with a drawstring in the middle. The liner band was attached to the helmet shell by 3 split pins, 2 in the front and 1 in the rear. Behind each leather pad is a cloth pouch stuffed with horsehair, which also happens to be one of the materials that the Germans used during the First World War. Overall, the liner design was most similar to that of the M17 Stahlhelm, as the M16 had a leather liner band while the M18 liner band had the chin strap attached, which is not a feature on the M21. On the M21, the chin straps are attached directly to the shell. The one on this helmet appears to be of a later model, identified by the Swedish Army Museum as the Model 1940 chin strap. Earlier chin straps had smaller, rectangular chin strap bales, and often had a brass buckle with rounded corners, instead of a square-shaped stainless steel one like you see here. There were 2 different variants of the M1921 helmet, a high dome and a low dome version. Collectors often referred to the high version as the M21/18 and the low version as the M21/16, although these are not official designations. The exact reason for having 2 different variants of the helmet shell is unknown, although the most commonly accepted explanation is that the high version was intended for use by frontline troops, while the low version was intended to be used by units in the rear, such as the Home Guards. However, photos show that oftentimes no distinction was made between the 2 types, and a unit would issue both the high and low versions to the troops. The low version is much less common than the high version and is one that I currently do not have in my collection. If you would like to see a video of one, I highly recommend checking out Stahlhelm Stan's video on it. His channel has loads of amazing content, and if you enjoy watching videos about militaria, you will definitely enjoy his channel as well. I have included the link in the description. A unique metal basket or net was sometimes worn with the helmets by frontline troops. However, there is limited information available about it, and it is unknown if it's an official item made by a factory or if they were handmade by soldiers. The basket is made of multiple pieces of wire which come together at the top and attaches onto the helmet by hooking onto the brim. Each piece of wire is looped multiple times, which is used for the attachment of foliage to the helmet. The wires look quite similar to screw pickets for barbed wire, although they appear to be much thinner. Another feature commonly found on M21 helmets are the blue and yellow Swedish 3-crown decals. These were initially added in 1942 on helmets used by the Swedish military and remained in use until after the war. They are also present on this example as well. Like many of the Swedish helmets, this helmet has also been repainted. The older gray-colored paint is still visible on the underside of the helmet, while the outside has been repainted into a greener shade. During the refurbishment process, the older decals were simply painted over, and the new decals applied over the new layer of paint. As a result, the previous decals are actually visible underneath the new paint. The presence of older decals beneath this layer of paint also means that the current paint job of the helmet was applied after 1942, and most likely applied during the late or post-war period. The M21 would be Sweden's main helmet for most of the 20s and 30s. A simplified version of the M21 was produced and was known as the Model 1926, but was not intended to be a combat helmet. The Model 1921 helmet was intended to be replaced by the Model 1937 in the late 1930s. However, the start of the Second World War meant that the M21 would remain in service with not only the Swedish military, but also groups such as the Home Guard and the police. Only after the end of the war were these helmets gradually replaced by the Model 37. Photos show that these helmets were still being used by the Home Guards in the 1970s, nearly half a century after they were introduced, making the M21 an extremely long-serving helmet. Overall, although the Swedish Model 1921 helmet is far from a rare one and is known by many, few know of the interesting history behind its design. Utilizing features from all three major World War I era steel helmets, this helmet is probably about as close one can get to combining the Mark I Brodie, the M1915 Adrian, as well as the M17 Stahlhelm.